I don't really talk very much about card games. I mean, I suppose I could do a video on the history of cards, playing cards, and it's been done many, many times. In fact, if you search Google, you'll come up with millions of references of playing card history. But I did get a request from one of my subscribers asking about the similarities and differences between several different games. And the main one in this case is called Pope Joan. There is a general category of card games that's called stops, and a very closely related game that's called a shedding game, where you're trying to get rid of all your cards. In the broadest sense of the word, it includes all those games where you will continue to get rid of your cards unless something happens. Uno would be included in that set. Technically, according to Hoyle, that's any game that is playing cards to a stack, building a sequence of cards that has stops, even if it's not a shedding game. So they're really kind of two compatible definitions. There's a few of those kinds of games you've probably heard of before. One's called Newmarket. It's also called Boodle. There's another called Fantan. That's also called Parliament or Card Dominoes. Go Stop is another one. It's actually a card game from Korea, but it fits into the same category. Mao is one that I remember playing back in the day. Very frustrating to some because it's a shedding game, but only one person knows the rules, and you're not supposed to tell them to anybody until they've violated a rule. But even then, you can't be clear. You just give them a penalty saying you violated a rule, and you have to figure out what it is. It's kind of related to the game Entropy. But anyway, back in 16th century France, there was a card game called Hock. And that evolved into a 17th century French card game called Comet. And that evolved into an 18th century card game from France called Matrimony. And finally that evolved into another French game called Yellow Dwarf. And that's where I got the name of this video. And the game of Yellow Dwarf is sometimes called Linder, in case you need something more to confuse you. And there's also a related game called Spinado. I don't know anything about that one. And I've seen another called Rose and Pentagram that apparently is related as well. First mention of Yellow Dwarf was in France in 1782. And it was first published in English in 1811 by a fellow named J. Wallace. But it didn't make it into Hoyle until 1826. Now I'm assuming that you're all familiar with Hoyle. It was back in the mid-1700s that a fellow named Edmund Hoyle wrote a book about the rules to popular games. And somehow his particular account of how to play these games and the descriptions became the international standard. So if anybody had a dispute about the rules to a game, they could go refer to Hoyle. And so that's where you get that phrase, according to Hoyle. In 1826, the game of Yellow Dwarf began to be called Pope Joan. Here's a German woodcut from the year 1474 showing the big gender reveal party at the Vatican. The legendary story of the female pope doesn't have anything to do with it. What it is the French for Yellow Dwarf is named John. And somebody misinterpreted that as Nun Joan, and then eventually that nun got promoted to pope. Now, because the game has a physical component to it, not just a deck of cards and some chips, so there are a lot of libraries and museums and private collectors that have the Pope Joan apparatus in their collection. And as you will see by this short slideshow, there are many different kinds. There are plain ones, there are fancy ones, there are some made of pressed paper, others carved mahogany and silver with pearl inlays, there's some made of metal, there's many of them made of plastic. I suppose there's something there to meet every budget, from the pub crawler to the high-born aristocrats. Yellow Dwarf is not Pope Joan. It's a whole nother game. Now here's an example of Nun John. Here's an example of Pope Joan. 5 compartments, 8 compartments. And there are even other mysteries, such as Bog, that has 6 compartments. And to further confuse the issue, the names seem to be somewhat interchangeable. But for the purposes of this video, let's just talk about Pope Joan. Now, I don't own a Pope Joan stakes board. That's what they call that apparatus. So what I did was I just printed something out on paper here to show you sort of the arrangement of what you'll see if you acquire a Pope Joan stakes board. Now, it is a gambling game for 3 to 8 players, and the objective is to get rid of all your cards. Now, it uses a standard poker deck plus the jokers, but the 8 of diamonds is removed from the deck, and the 9 of diamonds is called Pope Joan. It does have a particular role in the game. I'm not sure if it really deserves papal status, and it's really kind of arbitrary why they picked the 9 of diamonds and the 8 of diamonds to have this special function. I really don't know. Now, you'll want a lot of poker chips, counters of some kind in the game that will be placed around here. These are the compartments on the stakes board, and the stakes board, by the way, is quite often on a turntable, so you can whip things around there and get closer to the stakes that you're playing with. In later incarnations of the game, it might be on a cloth board or a piece of vinyl, a folding board like most board games, or even carved into a piece of wood. So it's called a stakes board. Not stakes, not stakes, but the stakes that you're trying to win. And the 8 compartments are labeled as follows: the ace, the queen, matrimony, which represents the king and queen as a combination, the king, intrigue, which is the jack and the queen. That jack, of course, is often called the knave. What the relationship is with the queen there, I'm not sure, but it sounds like a good royal scandal to me. The 9 of diamonds, which is the Pope. There's the jack of diamonds. And then this last one over here is called game, and we'll explain that later. The first dealer is generally just determined by a high card draw, and then that dealer dresses the board. And what that means is an initial supply of chips are put on the board. The Pope gets 6 counters. Matrimony and intrigue each get 2, and the others each get 1 counter apiece. All the cards get shuffled and they're dealt out to all the players, including 1 dummy player. And when that dealing is done, then the top card of the dummy player is turned face up, and that becomes the trump for that particular round. And in this particular case, we have spades. Now, apparently every player is supposed to end up with an even number of cards, the same number of cards. What you do with the extra cards, I'm not sure, but apparently they just are out of the game. Now, if that trump card happens to be one of the face cards, then, or an ace, that dealer gets the contents of the Pope compartment immediately. There's no playing of cards or anything. It's just kind of a chance reward they happen upon, and they get all those chips. According to some rules I've found, the eldest always goes first. That's usually me. And that player plays their lowest card to the table. Ace is low in this particular game, by the way. Now, if you also have the next highest card in that same suit, for instance, the ace was led, you'd have a 2, you play that also. This is all in your same turn. And you continue playing to that stack until you can't. And then whoever the next player is that can continue then takes over and starts to pile on that stack as well. This continues until the king is on top of the stack, and then it stops. And then the player who played that last card to that stack starts a new stack, putting down their lowest card, and then everybody plays to that stack. Now, we know that there's no 8 of diamonds in this deck, so when the 7 of diamonds is down, then that stops that stack. When a player lays down a card of the trump suit, that's a face card represented on the board here, or the Pope, then they get to take all the chips from that particular compartment. So, for example, if it's spades is trump and I lay down the ace of spades, then I get whatever's in that compartment. Or the combination of king and queen, or the combination of jack and queen. Now, it's possible that one player can play the jack, the queen, and the king, right, in succession. then they get to take from both those pots during that turn. The first player to run out of cards, they get to take the stakes that are in the game compartment on the wheel. And they also get a chip from each player that is equal to the number of cards they have left in their hand at that point. So if I've gotten rid of all but 2 of my cards, I have to pay the winner 2 chips out of my private stash. But if I have that Pope in my hand, I don't have to pay anything. I guess I got a special dispensation from the Vatican at that point. Now, if nobody happens to win what's in one of these compartments, the chips just stay there. And then the next time the next dealer around the table dresses the stakes, then they will accumulate. Okay, are you with me so far? Glad you could come along. Just a gentle appeal, if I may. Please like and share and subscribe and click the notification bell there if you're so inclined. That way you'll get a reminder every time I post a new video. We're getting real close to 4,000 subscribers as I record this, and it'd be great if we could push that right over the top. So if you can help out with that, that would be great. So thanks again for your support. Okay, so now to the other half of my subscribers' request. How does Pope Joan compare to Michigan Rummy and Tripoley? Michigan Rummy specifically wasn't invented or designed by anybody in particular. It sort of grew out of previous games in the same ilk and reached a point in the 1920s to where it was popular enough that commercial publishers decided they'd start boxing up the components and selling them as Michigan Rummy. Now, it appears to be a descendant of a German game called Poke, and Poke then is based on Pope Joan, so there's a genealogy there. Here are a few examples of some fairly recent commercial versions of Poke. It was first published around 1830 in Nuremberg by Schauer Verlag. There's even an Icelandic version called Puk, or I don't know, maybe it's called Puke, I'm not sure. Michigan Rummy has been manufactured by a lot of different publishers over the years. And it's also known as Rummy Royale, which has been consistently published by Whitman since the 1930s, 1938 I believe it was, and also by Watkins in England. And Western Publishing also has their version of Rummy Royale. Same game, different name. Now, Tripoley is known in some circles as 3-in-1, logically enough once you understand the rules. And Tripoley was designed in 1932 by Stanley Hopkins. And then in 1937, a newly formed company called Cattico Ellis, based out of Chicago, hired Mr. Hopkins and gained the rights to his game, Tripoley. I will probably do a video about Cattico someday, so stay tuned for that. Tripoley became a mainstay of their product line for decades afterwards. And of course, it's still being published today. And although there are a few tiny differences, same game, different name. The same game is also called Rummy in Canada and certain locales across the northern border of the United States. Rummy was first published by the Cop Clark Company in Toronto in 1940. Here are a few examples of that. But again, same game, different name. So let's review the rules to Tripoley briefly here, and you will get an idea of how all these games are played. Tripoley is advertised as being for from 2 to 9 players, but I hear the sweet spot is actually between 4 and 7. He uses a standard poker deck. In this case, the aces are high, and of course there's also the stakes board. This one is a real fancy turntable, plastic version. The name Tripoley kind of infers 3, the prefix tri. And so there are actually 3 different phases of this, 3 different games being played in the same sitting. And so we take them one at a time. The first game goes as follows. Each player starts out with 20 chips. This particular set comes with red and blue chips here. I imagine they're different denominations. But you start out with a value of 20. And then each player begins by putting 1 chip into each of the compartments. And then all the cards are dealt out, just like in Pope Joan, around the table, plus a dummy hand. Now the dealer can look at their hand and decide they don't like it. They can exchange that for the dummy hand, not knowing what's in the dummy hand. But once they do that, that's their hand for the game. So there's a little risk involved there. Now I have also seen variations in the rules that allow the dealer to auction off the dummy hand. How exactly that works, I'm not sure. Now in this case, the royals are not the diamonds as Pope Joan, they're hearts. Once all the cards are dealt out to everybody, then they look at their cards and they immediately can lay down a card that corresponds to any of these hearts cards on the board. So if I have the eights of hearts, I lay it down and I take whatever's in that pot. And you go around the circle here and lay down whatever combinations you have. Now over here you'll notice there's one called all one suit, 8, 9, 10. If you have the 8, 9, 10 of any suit, it doesn't have to be hearts, then you get what's in that pot. Now once all of those cards have been played, then you gather them all back up again, give them to the dealer, and the dealer will shuffle the deck and deal them all back out again. Now you'll have a handful of cards again. There's a dummy player, which I don't think goes through the exchange thing. I'll have to look that one up. But then from those cards, you pull your 5 best cards to make the winningest poker hand. And then bets are made around the table. Either pass, you call, or you raise the bet. If you pass, you can't add to the bet after that. And if you fold, you're just out of that phase of the game. And also, people usually agree on a limit to those bets. I think some of the rules actually say 10 is the limit for those bets. And so somebody wins that. Then when the poker round is done, then you get into the stop, which is the phase that's the most like Pope Joan. The winner of the poker hand starts this phase, very similar to Pope Joan, just lay your lowest card. People start stacking up on them. When a stop card is played, nobody can play on top of it. Then the next card played to start a new stack can't be the same suit as the previously played card. So that kind of breaks things up a little bit. There's a space here you'll notice called the kitty, and that's the same as the game space on the Pope Joan stakes board. And the final payout at the end of the round, which is based on the number of cards you have left over when somebody goes out, you don't pay that to the person that goes out, you pay it to the kitty. So that's one 3-part round. Apparently you can play just the 3 parts, or you can play a series of games and keep the pot growing, and it's entirely up to the players. Now my conclusion, and apparently that of most game historians, is that all these games, Michigan Rummy, Rummy Royal, Rumoli, Puck, and Tripoley, are for the most part the same game. Tripoley obviously has the other 2 phases before you get to the stops part of it, but that part is pretty much the same game as all the rest. Several reviews that I've read admit that there's a lot of arbitrariness to the game. There's a lot of chance involved. It just depends on what cards you've been dealt and where you're sitting around the table, how your results are going to be. It's almost devoid of player choice. All these games have been popular for generations now. Can be found in nearly every thrift shop and flea market that you go to. Popularity is not necessarily based on quality. And so, to the subscriber who asked for me to talk about Pope Joan and these other games, I hope that I satisfied your curiosity. Be sure that you let me know what you think in the comments section here. If you have some history or story to tell about playing it amongst your family and friends, that'd be great to share. I appreciate that. And remember, be sure to play every day. Wow, that video came out a lot longer than I thought it would. Are you still with me?